Mirror, mirror on the wall, who are all the attractive, single, early 30-somethings with beautiful personalities in my local area?
Don't tell him anything!
One more syllable out of your little soulless ginger mouth, and so help me God, I will get some tweezers and shove those gumdrop buttons so far up your— Hello, my fellow three-dimensional denizens of our mostly shared reality. Welcome to Horror Convos, where I happily use the dark arts to defy all conventions of privacy while seeking potential romantic interests, because I have lost far too much of my irreplaceable time, patience, energy, and sanity to the cesspool of modern online dating. Tinder, Bumble, Match, Plenty of Fish, I tried them all and can shamelessly say I would rather take my chances with the advice of a demonic entity behind a pane of glass than expend one more brain cell making one more profile that we all know most people don't even take the time to fully read. Attention spans are growing ever shorter with each generation of our chronically online youth, which is why I made an executive decision in the interest of my already fragile mental health to not waste one more day vying for your 5 seconds of screen skimming before you swipe left to the biggest boobs and/or biggest bulge to indulge in the social intimacy cancer of hookup culture.
Not one more day of this! Not one more day!
Horror Convos is a casual, relaxing, and occasionally funny podcast where we choose one topic per episode and discuss horror media related to it, as well as my own personal history, thoughts, and opinions with that topic. We then segue into examples of media that portray the subject well, versus one or two that sell it not so well. I often have guests join in the conversation, and we hold regular polls for you to decide what topic is covered on our Patreon exclusive For the Fans episodes. If you prefer not to have ads eat up precious seconds of your life that you'll never get back, you can listen to the full podcast ad-free on Patreon too. Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and punch that notification bell like a jealous beta when he sees his own reflection, so you never miss when our newest stuff is uploaded.
Oh, look at that handsome man.
You son of a bitch!
This is going to be a shorter episode today for two reasons. One, because of unexpected technical difficulties with the previous episode, which debuted what will be a recurring topic, horror classics that deserve a remake. Yeah, due to unforeseen complications at the time, the details of which I won't bore you with, I ended up actually having to record and edit most of that episode twice, which meant the time needed to finally finish and upload the damn thing left me with less time than I'd originally planned to work on this episode. Reason number two, I put so much more work into that last episode than anything I've done so far on this podcast that the amount of time needed to edit it to a satisfying end result also affected my prep time for this topic. You know, I'm a perfectionist, which admittedly can be my Achilles heel when it comes to my creative process, but I like you guys. I'm growing fond of you. I enjoy what I do, and I want it to be the best that it can be. Honestly, like that last episode, easily both my favorite and my absolute least favorite that I've done so far, just for the sheer amount of shit that I went through to finally get it done. But thankfully everything's back on track, no cause for concern, Hakuna Matata. So what's going to happen today is this is essentially going to be the first of what will become a two-part discussion. The topic of both this and the upcoming episode will cover the subject of horror of mirrors. We'll spend today going over the history of this subgenre as well as my personal experience with it before delving into a brief comparison between an example of what I consider to be high quality in how it utilizes mirrors for horror versus one that uses it to a lesser quality result. The next episode, part 2 of this conversation, will focus more on a singular icon in mirror horror, you probably already know who, and we will cover the same ground regarding how that character has influenced the subgenre across different media. So again, I apologize if this podcast isn't up to the length you've come to expect from me. To clarify, most episodes won't be as long as the horror classics that deserve a remake discussions, most likely. I humbly ask for your forgiveness, but hope you enjoy what material we do have time to go into today. Just think of this episode like an appetizer to whet your appetite for the main course and dessert. You just gotta let us cook. In the meantime, have a seat, relax. We'll get things started off with what you might like to drink, so why not live a little and order from that top shelf tonight?
I am so freaking wasted!
So, as far back as whatever point it was that our early ancestors first discovered primitive, naturally reflective surfaces that allowed them to see their own reflection, most commonly in water, but also stuff like certain types of crystallized minerals, glass formed by sand that was struck by lightning or burned by just in intense heat from fire, etc., something to that effect. I'd imagine that we've always found mirrors in any form simultaneously alluring and frightening to some extent, even if only on an unconscious level, and not just because for a long time we didn't understand what these reflections were or how they worked, but also because, as with most things in life that frighten us, many people simply didn't want to understand, that they wanted nothing to do with it at all, often because the answers may in fact be even more terrifying than the mystery. That old saying of, once you know something, you can't unknow it. I would respectfully disagree with that, though. I mean, there are numerous ways you can potentially erase knowledge from yourself. And people found ways to do that for centuries. So the quickest method is amnesia.
How to take care of those pesky memories.
But I do think, more so than a fear of understanding, this does ultimately go back to fear of the unknown, which, like many, I personally believe is the root of all fear, the original fear, which by extension makes it essentially the root of all horror, at least as horror relates to fear. We know from decades, if not centuries now, of other discussions on this topic that the three emotional pillars that are arguably necessary for horror to exist, meaning you need one or more of these emotional triggers. These three are commonly agreed to be something that provokes a feeling of fear, disgust, and or a general lack or loss of control. Well, all three of these elements tie into virtually every characteristic of horror that you will find across any media in any culture that we put the horror label onto, as well as media fitting into genres and subgenres that are commonly viewed as spin-offs of what we feel in regards to horror. This includes feelings like terror, suspense, dread, or general discomfort. Every single emotion that we could possibly describe in relation to things that scare and or revolt us. This, I believe, can be traced back to a natural primal aversion or hesitance in the face of the unknown. We evolved to instinctively fear that which we cannot understand, which in itself can be implied to also be that which we cannot control. We are perhaps the only species, or at least the only known species on this planet, with the higher mental faculties to comprehend our own insignificance, our primal survival instinct, which was absolutely necessary to help us survive long enough to spread, advance, and prosper, to become the self-proclaimed dominant species of Earth. I would argue that species is actually the virus, or maybe the mosquito, depending on your point of view. And a major factor in that survival, particularly in hunter-gatherer times, was our capacity to interpret most anything we do not understand with the very simple mental equation of, oh, I don't know what this is, or this is not familiar, therefore I don't know that it's not dangerous, and if there is even a 1.1% chance that it is dangerous, then I must assume that it is and either reject it or investigate it. And this really played a critical role in our ability to engage with our surroundings, including with other early humans who displayed physical, auditory, and or behavioral traits that initially made us instinctively uncomfortable and therefore hesitant to interact with each other, but because we didn't yet understand how much we had in common. There's tons of this kind of stuff you can read about and listen to actual experts on the subject go into detail on, and the more you understand the roots of human psychology by tracing it back to the various causes of and correlations between our most primitive behaviors and responses to different stimuli, the more you begin to better understand and gain a deeper appreciation for where virtually every single one of our most base impulses, fears, prejudices, and first instincts when put into specific positions, environments, and circumstances comes from. And a lot of this really goes back to the fundamental internal confrontation that we first had to overcome in order to start working together, to form basic social skills, learn to live together on a day-to-day basis, and form communities, which ultimately developed into the civilizations we know today. The first wall that we had to learn to climb over when it came to this internal struggle was the instinctive conflict of perception of reality in regards to accepting the differences between the self and the external, learning to understand, accept, and eventually embrace the reality that there are things and people around us that matter and should have value placed upon them or recognized in relation to how we might benefit from them, and vice versa, how they could benefit from us. It was that very early act of just starting to work with social building blocks by overcoming the mentality of me versus them. So once we learned the value of perceiving value in needing and embracing that which lies outside of ourselves, and we stopped trying to survive like lone wolves, avoiding other early humans as if they were another predator in the wild to steer clear of, we stopped thinking it's me versus everything else, everything is out to get me, I can only ever count on myself. Well, that's the opposite of how we were meant to thrive as a species. Is the second wall to climb after we got over that first one, and this is the same wall we're still climbing in some capacity to this day. We've made some progress with it, but we still have a long way to go with it. That second internal primal sociological wall is the struggle of us versus them. It's the struggle to not only accept that there are people and things in this world that differ from you and your tribe, communities, social circles, whatever, but those differences are not inherently good or bad. Our earliest instinct for so long, which we inherited across generations of gradually influenced instincts from the trauma of centuries of warring with each other over, territory and resources, I think, was this inherited instinct of different equals bad. Again, lack of understanding. I don't understand this, therefore it could be dangerous.
Not like you and me, which means they must be evil.
Because, no man is an island. Nobody can make it their entire life in this world alone. We're never born alone. We never truly die alone, depending on what you define the range of alone to mean. I personally define it in the broadest sense. Plenty of people can die lonely or feeling alone, but nobody in this world is ever truly, literally alone at the beginning or the end. And, not at any time, really. It's not physically possible. Well, unless you're literally the only life form remaining on the planet. It all comes down to spatial and interpersonal perception. And that's how I look at it anyway. And it helps me sometimes, when I start to feel depressed and stuff. Yeah, it's interesting to me how our court system in the U.S. stands on this legal bedrock of the presumption of innocence, innocent until proven guilty.
Uh-oh.
Incoming rant.
Alert.
Incoming rant.
Alert, class.
But instinctively, that tends to kind of contradict a significant number of people's natural instinct, doesn't it? Like, most of us, I would guess, teach our kids to distrust strangers. There's, stranger danger, don't be gullible, don't be naive. We're taught from an early age not to trust what we don't understand in context of strangers.
Stranger danger.
I do personally believe it's in over 99% of people's nature to distrust to some extent. Now, at least in Western countries, I can't speak for every modern society. We teach that trust should be earned, correct? But as we get older, it's usually our first instinct to not trust, isn't it? There are outliers, of course, but the moment we learn and comprehend the concept of deceit, that changes us, doesn't it? Same thing with the news. We assume the worst of countless people accused of committing crimes before we know anywhere near all the facts available, at least in our own minds when it supports our own biases only, typically switching to defending that person when it's someone we personally know and like, or a celebrity or politician we're biased towards, often due to some parasocial relationship with them. Isn't that interesting? And again, I do believe this ties into our innate distrust of mirrors, yet when it comes to the legal system, we've built an entire system around the idea of basically saying, yeah, here's a stranger you know nothing about until we show you the evidence, which in itself is referenced to support one narrative or the other, defense versus prosecution. And you should assume that this person is innocent, which can imply trustworthy. Assume that this individual, from your position as the jury, is an innocent soul until reason to distrust and or dislike them is provided with evidence. When you put it that way, even in context, does that not kind of sound like an exercise in not following the inherent distrust, assuming the worst of strangers that so many of us are brought up to think when we're children? And, obviously it's more complicated than that. The purpose of a jury isn't to like someone, it's to determine whether they committed a crime. But you know what I mean. It's like one moment we think you should assume anyone you don't know is unworthy of the benefit of the doubt. When you're a kid, assume they're unsafe to be around until they prove otherwise, so the burden of proof is on them.
He was my neighbor!
Yet as adults serving in jurors in a U.S. court, we're expected to assume the opposite of whatever person is in front of us that we don't know until it's proven that they're unsafe to be around because they did what they're accused of. Is that not a paradox of behavioral programming, even when you take the context of, the law into account? Or are you not being asked to follow two separate guidelines here, essentially? Tell me in the comments, what do you think about this? In the grand scheme of human history, I would say the presumption of innocence as a concept is a very recent idea. We didn't do things that way for a long time, from what I understand. But again, I think we do enter a very similar contract of trustworthiness that also similarly kind of feels contradictory to our generationally influenced behavioral nature. When it comes to our relationship with our own reflection, it's a social contract that we enter with something our primitive brains perceive to be another being, when in reality it's us entering a social contract with ourselves, and we do this from such an early age that, as complex as it is, we don't even really consciously think about the paradox or sort of insanity of it. There's a point to all of this, I promise. I'm not changing topics into a totally different discussion, but my point is that from my assessment, all of this ties into why we so often feel this natural, primal discomfort toward mirrors, including tribalism, I would argue. It all factors into our relationship with reflections, because following this logic, your reflection is almost always perceived to be outside your tribe by default, due to the fact that it does not exist on the same physical plane as you and, people your tribe, in the physical three-dimensional world we inhabit. Because when you think about it from, again, a standpoint of the evolution of human behavior and generational behavioral influences and programming, the very existence of reflective surfaces and being able to perceive our own reflections, it really kind of fucks with us in a major way psychologically that I would propose fundamentally contradicts a lot of how we're biologically designed and environmentally as well as socially taught to trust reality, and by extension, trust other human beings. There's an inherent sort of paradox, I think, in how our brains are used to differentiating that which is external, outside of us, apart from us, to be a separate being, a separate thing or presence, whatever you call it, versus differentiating from all of that which is objectively different and making this sort of exception to perceive and accept that this one particular external visual stimulus, your reflection, is in fact not a separate being. It is not another person. It is you.
How am I doing today, Gary Busey? You're doing great. Good. Then I'll keep it up.
It is you seeing yourself outside of yourself, looking back at yourself. You're not only seeing what you look like, presumably to everyone around you with functioning eyes, you're also seeing every single one of your movements down to the tiniest traces of body language you would never notice from a first-person perspective, which, first person being the natural state of how we perceive the world around us. Yes, and how we catalog and process data, throughout our lifespans, and that is our normal. Well, and unless of course you're blind, in which case, direct all your hate mail towards my editor, and everything you do while looking at this externalized image, the image perfectly imitates in sync with your own movement. I mean, I say imitate, but it's not really imitation. See right there, caught myself in a moment of perceiving something to be more than what it objectively is. But that's the trick of it, isn't it? Every twitch, every expression, every insignificant little fiber of your surface level being is outside looking at, as well as arguably looking in. Seriously, it all sounds weird, right? Just hearing me try to describe it, and you only relate to what I mean because you've seen it yourself. I mean, am I wrong? Just like hypothetically, try to imagine articulating purely in words with no visual reference at all what a mirror or a reflection is to someone who's never once seen any reflection, let alone seen their own. It would probably sound like some of the trippiest, most implausible supernatural shit, wouldn't it? Especially if you were living in olden times. Granted, you could say this about trying to describe virtually anything to someone who's never been exposed to it, of course. I mean, I don't know how many of you know about this story, but Plato's allegory of the cave, which I actually did a short film of for my college philosophy and ethics class, when I went to J. Sargent Reynolds. If you're interested in that story and curious about my version of it, you can find it on my personal YouTube channel. Well, the channel is called Just Me, and the video is called Plato's Allegory of the Cave, a Modernization. That's basically what I'm talking about here, in the same sense of perception of reality, but narrowing it down to this topic, I do believe mirrors are still unique when it comes to this, in a way that most externalized things our brains process are not. The defining reason for this could be that mirrors are the first exposure I think we ever have, at least in nature, to experiencing the uncanny valley, looking at something that looks like you, looks human, but the very nature of reflections and all the little details our brains notice tell us that there's something off about it, but because the surface of whatever it is that's causing that reflection, and however perfect a mirror may be, there's still always those little tiny flaws or imperfections, whether it's in the image itself or maybe the construction of the surface reflecting it, that just our brains just instinctively know that there's something kind of off about it. So, it's like Red Letter Media, whatever his name is from that YouTube channel says, you may not notice, but your brain does. Is again, it's you, but it's not you, and that just really fascinates me. Like, as intelligent as we are, our brains are still very primitive in some ways when it comes to how we reconcile what we logically understand versus what our instincts, again, particularly our outdated ones, make us just naturally feel uncomfortable in the face of these things sometimes, and our capacity to rise above that nature, to consciously choose not to act on those primal impulses and blindly follow our survival instincts because they are incorrect sometimes. Our ability to do that under almost any circumstances is itself an incredible, arguably miraculous thing. We are ultimately still subordinate to our instincts on some level. We never 100% control them, but the very act of being able to choose to act in a way that contradicts them, that is undeniable proof of higher brain functioning. It is an act of sheer will supported by our brain's capacity to rationalize and reason, but that internal conflict between the reason and the primal, like, lizard brain is always there. We fight it on some level practically every waking minute of every day until we die. I know I'm rambling, trust me, but it's fascinating to me how this all ties into our psychology, but even if you somehow manage to make perfect sense of all of it, it's still kind of innately creepy, isn't it? But because, again, you can't reason away a primal fear. It's a fear that's been with us for so long, we may never evolve enough to completely rid ourselves of it, you know, unless, of course, we become just like energy beings that transcend our physical shells, and, you know, eventually we're living like the Dredge from Titan AE. Yeah, great movie. And again, from a survival standpoint, I don't think it would be beneficial for us to get rid of those instincts altogether. That's not overcoming the conflict or climbing the wall. That would just be trading one set of problems for another, I think. This will all be expanded on in the next episode, but for now, I'm actually going to play some audio from a video that goes more in depth on the science behind why mirrors and reflections in general affect us the way they do. It's a video from the YouTube channel, this is going to be a bit of a tongue twister, SciShow Psych, titled Why You See Monsters in the Mirror. If you're interested in the full video or watching more of their stuff, then please like and subscribe to them. So here it is, and we will be right back after I take a leak.
It's weird that looking at your reflection for too long makes you see a face in the mirror that's distorted and definitely not yours. That's literally the opposite of what mirrors are for, but even though it's a little freaky, it can tell us a lot about how our brains process images, especially faces. In 2010, an Italian researcher asked 50 people to look into a mirror for 10 minutes in a dimly lit room and write down everything they saw. 2/3 of them saw a distorted version of their own face. Over a quarter saw someone that they'd never met before, or what looked like an old woman or a child, and I'm literally getting goosebumps. This is freaking me out. Almost half of them reported seeing quote-unquote fantastical and monstrous beings. Some of this weirdness can be explained by the Troxler effect, where things in your peripheral vision start to fade as you focus on something in the middle. That's because the neurons in your eyes, like other sensing neurons, stop reacting when they get the same stimulus over and over and over again. It's kind of like how you get used to smells or stop feeling your shirt on your skin when you're sitting still, or have no idea that these glasses are always on your face, even though they're always there. But you don't just see holes. Your brain tries to fill in the gaps in your visual field by blending with the surrounding scenery. So staring into your reflection's eyes can make your chin, ears, and forehead fade, Cheshire Cat style. But the Troxler effect alone doesn't explain why you see other people in the mirror. Psychologists think that that may have more to do with the way we perceive faces. Studies like the Thatcher illusion, where researchers flipped the eyes and mouth on a picture of Margaret Thatcher upside down to create a horrifying monster, show that we process the image of a face as a gestalt, a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So when certain features that you know are supposed to be part of a face are wrong or disappear, you start to to have trouble processing them. Some researchers think that's what's happening when you stare in the mirror for too long. The Troxler effect causes distortion and fading, which disrupts the assembly of various facial features into a gestalt, therefore making the face feel more like it belongs to someone or something else. All 50 participants in the 2010 study reported feeling some amount of disassociation from their reflection. The way they felt about the things they saw in the mirror depended on what they saw. Those that saw a terrible monster were understandably more freaked out than those that saw a rando smiling at them. But they all had the sense that the face in the mirror belonged to an other, a sign that high-level facial processing was being disrupted. Not recognizing your reflection might not seem like that big of a deal, but there's a good reason it freaks people out. The ability to recognize yourself in a mirror is strongly linked to your development of a sense of self. It's something few species can do, and even we humans can't do it until we're about 20 months old. Recognizing your own reflection isn't the only indicator of self-awareness, but it's a pretty important one. Researchers think it's part of a series of milestones that lead to developing your sense of self, as well as the understanding that other people have their own beliefs and desires. So looking in a mirror and seeing a face that's not your own might be more than just creepy. It might actually cause a bit of an identity crisis for a second there. What psychologists can't explain is why we see monsters. Weird, creepy Bloody Marys? Sure. But these ideas don't fully explain why we see non-human faces. It's one of those psychological mysteries that, when solved, could teach us a lot more about how our brains work. So if you're getting chills looking at your reflection, just turn on the lights, maybe don't look quite so long at yourself in the mirror. It's not actually a monster. Pinky swear.
Keep doing it. Boy, that was some good peeing.
Yeah, interesting to think that Tom Hanks has played both a character who was uncommonly efficient at urinating versus a character with a bladder infection. I tell you, there's almost no role that man can't step into. Once-in-a-generation talent. So yeah, there's certainly a deep rabbit hole you could go down with this topic. Urination? Reflections are really a perfect vehicle for a personal, interpersonal, and internal horror associated with the human condition. You know, we practically worship mirrors. We put so much attention into our reflections and general appearance in modern civilization. They're so integrated into our everyday infrastructure that the whole cosmetics industry as we know it wouldn't exist without mirrors. How many advertisements, even ones not related to cosmetics, have you seen that involve or outright revolve around characters looking at themselves in a mirror? How many feature at least one person holding a pocket mirror, most often women? How many times on average do you look at your reflection per day?
Oh, strange. Should watch road, but can't look away. Too beautiful.
Say what you will about the Amish, and believe me, I could do a whole episode about horror related to that. Maybe we'll cover it in a future religious horror episode. But admittedly, maybe they were onto something with the whole vanity thing. Their faceless dolls are still fucking creepy. Like, you don't need the internet, Jebediah. We have Slender Man at home. But even outside the context of vanity, we have this just historical, almost kind of, I don't want to say symbiotic, but it may be parasocial fixation with mirrors. Referencing the Greeks, how many of us have heard the alleged accounts of Archimedes' death ray mirrors used to set fire to a whole naval fleet? God, that was one of my favorite Mythbusters episodes. Who else? Comment below. Where are my Mythbusters fans at? It's how many cultures have you heard attribute supernatural elements to mirrors as objects of pagan rituals, divination, like how do you say it? Catroptomancy.
Flawless pronunciation.
Summoning and or communicating with spirits and demons. Medusa, windows into other worlds like Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass, or it's another parallel plane of existence.
Looks like you're going to the Shadow Realm, Jimbo.
There's some mirror world apparently that us three-dimensional folk just can't access until we meditate to open our third eye, or some Buddhist hoodoo voodoo
Actually,
like that.
voodoo is Haitian.
Actually, you were an accident. Hey, speaking of accidents, break a mirror, 7 years of bad luck. How many superstitions are tied to mirrors that still live rent-free in the back of our heads, along with cracks, ladders, knocking on wood, and black cats?
Racist.
Remember all the iconic mirrors from pop culture, like a Harry Potter's Mirror of Erised?
It's desire spelled backwards. Dear God.
How many versions of ghosts or vampires or other entities of that nature stuck with us in our nightmares specifically because of how they didn't show up in mirrors or photographs? Photos, what are cameras if not more advanced cousins of mirrors, with photos being a snapshot of our external selves immortalized like frozen reflections? And, even in fiction that doesn't directly use mirrors, we've still, used them countless times in metaphors. How many stories have used the old symbolism of holding a mirror up to us, or society for who we truly are, and us choosing to turn a blind eye to it? I guess the most popular example right now, visually speaking, is a Stranger Things Upside Down. Even the term for the phobia of mirrors and reflections lends itself to that eeriness, doesn't it? A spectrophobia sounds like specter. Scientists spent centuries studying those ancient bronze Eastern mirrors just to prove that they weren't supernatural, which for a long time they concluded that they were, men of science. And apparently to this day, we still don't know exactly how they were constructed to work the way they do, though I presume we can probably rule out sorcery now, because certain essential records of their manufacturing process have been lost to time. They no longer exist. That, or the Chinese are just hiding them from us, along with their long-kept secret arts of how to punch and kick through human torsos like butter.
I mean, crap, man. Look at that.
We will learn those techniques, China. We are straight white Americans, which means we deserve it.
Fuck yeah! Oh, come on. It's just a joke. Still.
But yeah, how about those Eastern mirrors, huh? Check that shit out. And if you want to learn more about that, check out the video, The Secret of Real-Life Magic Mirrors of the Far East, by Mike Chen from Beyond Science. And if you really want to go off into the deep end of the psychological pull, read up on the now, I did not know this, apparently very common spiritual practice of mirror gazing, particularly the ritual of staring at your own reflection for 10 minutes in the dark. Then you'll really see some shit, even without needing to bring Mary into it. Yeah, guaranteed a monster will show up if you stare at yourself without makeup at 3 in the morning.
Oh boy, 3 a.m.
But yeah, apparently it's this whole practice of, apparently people believe it lets you communicate with your subconsciousness, or manifest your unconscious mind, or something. I don't know the particulars of exactly how the belief system of it works. Guaranteed I won't be doing it myself anytime soon. I see way too much of my ugly mug in broad daylight already. Yeah, but it's interesting if you want to read the brochure for it. So my earliest exposure to the idea of mirrors or reflections in terms of them being scary was probably Snow White. I definitely remember finding the evil queen's magic mirror very creepy. That angry opera mask looking face with the smoke around it was nightmare fuel to me at probably 4 to 5 years old. I felt similarly about The Wizard of Oz the first time I saw it, when the wizard enlarges his face onto that giant projector. I don't think it was technically a mirror. I don't remember what the device was exactly. God, I haven't sat down to watch The Wizard of Oz in years. But it still reminded me of the mirror from Snow White just because of the face. The concept of being watched through a mirror, I probably got from the first time I saw the criminally underappreciated masterpiece that is The Truman Show with Jim Carrey. I mean, as popular as it is, I still say it could always be praised a little bit more. To this day, there's still so much that we really come to appreciate about the different layers of just the commentary that it provided on society, entertainment, and just the nature of human psychology and existentialism. Yeah, that's probably the first time that I saw something that put the idea in my head of, oh, what if someone's watching me from a hidden camera or some hole in the wall behind a mirror? I don't know. I mean, maybe Psycho, like Norman Bates, influenced that to some extent. The general paranoia we have, at least sometimes when we see our reflections in the mirror, or it can be traced back to pretty much any instance we have of thinking that we see it in our peripheral vision and it moves or does something, and then we look and it turns out that was just our peripheral vision playing tricks on us. I think I actually had a mirror in my bedroom at one time as a kid, but back when we lived at our old house, so this would have been like at least 15 years ago. I don't remember if it was a stand-up mirror or one hanging on the wall, but I think I ended up moving it out of my room because no matter where I situated it, I just couldn't sleep well with this paranoia of thinking it was watching me at night, like either my reflection or something else standing in its place. I definitely spooked myself from my own reflection in the dark at least once when I was little. And again, I think that's common. We didn't evolve to be a nocturnal species despite what my night owl metabolism thinks. Do not let your circadian rhythm get screwed. You will regret it later in life. So naturally, any figure you see in the dark that you don't immediately recognize, even in your peripheral vision, and especially in your peripheral vision, of course it's normal that it would instinctively make you uneasy. Again, fear of the unknown. I mean, I don't want you coming near me when you're just a shadow stalking in the night, no matter who you are. The dark makes everyone scary. It don't matter if you're black or white. Candyman, I actually did not watch as a young kid. I'm sure I'd seen maybe glimpses of Tony Todd as the character, or maybe glimpses of him on TV in passing when we were flipping channels, but my family, especially my mom or my grandmother, never would have let me watch that, especially when I was little. But I heard the name, I think, not just from Willy Wonka, but also from the context of this character with a hook for a hand. I feel like I knew of it, but I didn't sit down to watch the film until I was in my mid to late teens. The character made the film scary more so than the mirror itself, I would say, though, especially when he appears several times in places and situations that don't require a mirror or where a mirror isn't present. And so, once he's summoned by Helen, he's not really limited to appearing to her or manifesting from within mirrors. Or he operates more like a ghost at that point, with just teleporting around. 2002's original Ju-on The Grudge had that creepy blink and you might miss it moment where the main protagonist, Rika, walks by a mirror in the cursed house and you see Kayako's reflection quickly move in sync with her in the background, which makes her freeze because I think she notices out of the corner of her eye that black hair that's much longer than hers. I don't know if I caught that the first time I saw that movie. I think I actually had to rewind it, which, knowing me, would have made the impact of it that much creepier. And it's a perfect visual to convey how this curse latches onto its victims like an infection. Stories of Bloody Mary I grew up with, of course. Hearing about her is about as common as hearing about the boogeyman.
Equality!
I didn't play the Bloody Mary game in the bathroom as far as I can recall growing up. I would have been way too chicken to do that as a kid. I'm pretty sure I did say it in a mirror at some point when I was a teenager just to try it out, maybe in a bathroom stall in the mirror in high school or something. And when, of course, nothing happened, I got on with my day and cried into my pillow that night over having apparently been rejected by a ghost. I don't remember any particular film or on-screen version of the Bloody Mary character that significantly stuck with me. I'm sure I saw many different versions of her in, movies, TV, and so on. The only recent example that probably sticks out to me is her character design from 2013's The Wolf Among Us video game by Telltale, which was an adaptation of the comics, I believe. Her true form that we see during her final battle with Bigby Wolf in the 5th episode, I think it is, was certainly creepy with, the glass shards poking out of her body that she pulls out of her own flesh to attack you with. I assume that she could also potentially use them as reflective surfaces to teleport herself around when there are no mirrors to use in her surrounding environment. Maybe she throws one of those glass shards onto the floor behind you as a way to teleport behind you, or as a last resort to retreat back into her mirror world when necessary. I forget exactly what the limits of her powers were in the Wolf Among Us mythos, but I do remember it gave her the ability to duplicate herself from, I think, any reflective surface until she had a small army of doppelgangers to swarm you with. There's a lot of chilling detail put into her design and mechanics in that game. The bloody symbols carved into her flesh that I guess could be compared to some versions of her backstory claiming she was burned at the stake as a witch or under suspicion of witchcraft. I don't think any version of the story places her in Salem, but I'm pretty sure there is at least one version claiming she was a witch or accused of being one. I do like how, much like Batman's Joker, she really doesn't have a consistent origin, which adds to the mystery of her character. Then, again, talking about her design in The Wolf Among Us, you have the bloody black eyes with the glowing red irises. That was a nice detail, I thought, to illustrate how our eyeballs are like the mirrors of our own faces, windows to the soul and all that. And the darkness of her eyes is a perfect visual for a character being portrayed here as this soulless mirror demon who is just such a shit-eating, horrible monster who long since abandoned whatever humanity she may have had in the past, and now she just relishes causing suffering to others because that's all she knows anymore. Yeah, we're definitely going to get deep into discussing her next episode, don't worry. Apart from that, the most recent examples for mirror horror I can think of would be the Bloody Mary sequence in Paranormal Activity 3. I personally was never a big fan of the Paranormal Activity films beyond maybe the first one. I never thought they were really all that scary, and the found footage novelty that they used, I got bored with it pretty fast. But by the fourth one in, I was just kind of checked out on the series, but I would say that in terms of scare factor, the first and the third one are definitely far and away the best. Then there's how Pennywise stalked that little kid in the funhouse and killed him in front of adult Bill in 2019's It Chapter 2. A creative use of a funhouse for a scary alien entity disguised as a clown. A very nice cinematography to show the confusion and misdirection of trying to pursue or escape from something stalking a room of mirrors. There's 2021's Candyman sequel also took advantage of mirrors for some pretty decent scares and kills, but again, due to the nature of its story and how Candyman works as a character, I still think it made the character himself the center of the horror more so than the actual mirrors. And now we'll touch on a couple examples of what I'd consider to be high-quality mirror-based horror versus lesser quality. It's time for the good, the bad, and the... First example of what I would personally consider the highest quality of mirror horror, at least in the medium of film, Mike Flanagan's Oculus. This film is a masterclass to me in Mike Flanagan's ability to go into psychological horror. Like, I'm definitely going to discuss him and like his entire body of work in a future episode, but this was the first thing of his that I ever remember seeing, and holy shit, what a first impression. But what I really appreciate the most about it, outside the performances of the cast and the progression of the story, is it's the best film I've ever seen in terms of making you afraid of the mirror itself. Not just a reflection or entity coming from inside of it. The mirror itself is portrayed as this living, breathing, evil as fuck creature with intent and will behind it as it's manipulating reality around it. It's basically Stephen King's Room 1408 if you reduced it to a single appliance or piece of furniture instead of an entire room. But I could go on about this one film for like a whole episode in itself, but the way it plays with both playing tricks on the mind of the characters and the audience, and playing with this ambiguity of, leaving you on this cliffhanger of, was it all supernatural or was it all in the brother's head?
There's a glitch in the Matrix. This world's not real, Mom!
Did both of these kids, the siblings, inherit some mental illness from their dad or their mom? Every character in this movie, through which we perceive the story, is an unreliable narrator, so we never really get the true account, or at least not the entire full picture of what actually happened versus what the characters thought happened or were influenced to think from what the mirror may or may not have done. If you want to watch another video that goes more in depth on the psychology of this movie and just how many different layers are going on with the way it fucks with you, I highly recommend the video by Ryan Hollinger. He's one of the most well-known horror YouTube reviewers probably on the entire platform. I followed him for years. Don't agree with all of his takes, but he goes in depth on this stuff to a level that even I don't think I could reach. And he always gives me a perspective on whatever it is he's discussing, especially if it's something I've already seen. That like 9 times out of 10 will make me think of it in ways I never thought of before. So I watch him all the time, especially when he's discussing something that I'm researching for the podcast. I'm always curious to get his point of view and compare it to whatever thoughts I'm thinking of on a subject that I plan to talk about. Otherwise, even if it's not something I plan to talk about, he's just, always an interesting guy to listen to anyway. The second example I can think of for maybe not high quality but above average, it would be 2008's Mirrors, starring Kiefer Sutherland from French director Alexandre Aja, of High Tension, The Hills Have Eyes remake, Crawl, Horns, and more recently Oxygen. And he's done some pretty major stuff over his career. A lot of different movies. He's from particularly the 2000s onward that have been influential to audiences. But Mirrors, I remember renting, I think, from Blockbuster or Hollywood Video back in the day, and I wasn't overly impressed with it. I mean, but it was one of those cases where I think the trailer was better than the movie. I mean, especially Paula Patton's performance when she says in the trailer, "There's something in the house." The film as a whole was mostly average in my opinion. Not what I'd consider one of Kiefer Sutherland's best performances either, but it uses the novelty of reflections being able to target you from any reflective surface to very good effect. Doorknobs, water, rear view mirrors, it sliding doors of glass, just like that closet door the kid sees the reflection of that dead girl in. And it really sold the threat level of just how many different places these killer reflections could appear in or from. I mean, that whole movie is basically like if you took DC Comics' Flash villain Mirror Master and made him into a serial killer. Amy Smart's death in the bathtub scene, highlight of the entire movie, some of the best quality body horror I've ever seen, just about perfectly set up, great suspense build-up, cringe-inducing execution in the best way. It worked so well that it could have functioned as its own little horror short film with a little bit of rewriting. Do not watch it if you suffer from slack jaw. You will feel personally attacked.
Hey, my doctor says my jaw's only slightly slack.
The reason I put it below Oculus is mainly because this is kind of a nitpick. I know this is just me, but it makes the reflections scarier than the mirrors themselves. It's just, I was more scared of the actual mirror in Oculus. It's like I perceived the mirror to be the villain, and whereas with most horror involving mirrors, and including 2008's Mirrors despite its title, I think the selling point of that film's horror was more what was found within the mirrors or what came out of the mirrors to try and, get at you. Same thing with Bloody Mary. I mean, Oculus used scary reflections, too. I'm not saying it didn't cover any of those tropes, but its range of how it messed with the characters and the audience, it's had more variety beyond that. It really went the extra mile to portray just how quickly our perception of reality can crumble, and what a nervous breakdown, mess we become once you remove that thin veil of understanding three-dimensional reality versus is the reality that is supposed to remain consistent with reflections. Again, going back to that fear of lack of control, that's at the root of basically every kind of horror story where some rule of reality that you've become accustomed to is suddenly just turned on its head, and out of nowhere you have to, adapt or die. That's the main appeal of pretty much all zombie fiction, and especially Romero's original trilogy, where the zombification never gets a confirmed explanation. It's just, as the man said it himself, Romero in interviews, he would sum it up as, one day God just changed the rules. And you could apply that same principle to how we'd react if one day our reflections just suddenly became sentient, and for whatever reason, supernatural, science fiction, AI gone wrong, whatever the fuck. Just it's that core principle of, holy shit, this does not make sense. Now I know how Sam Neill felt in the mouth of madness. Okay, so now let's get into the 2006's Stay Alive, the only slasher technically released under Disney. Look it up. It's interesting to me how this integrates mirrors into the legend of Countess Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, as some would call the real-life female Dracula. But the mirror itself serves in that movie as little more than a plot device to her story, as opposed to the story or even her presence being written around the mirror itself. I understand that the premise revolves around a haunted video game, but the game or the TV and computer monitors it plays on could have been utilized more as a medium for Elizabeth's power to come through like a mirror. I mean, in the lore of the film, I don't know how much of this is documented in real life, but it goes on about how she broke every mirror in her house because she couldn't stand to see herself old. Mirrors could be used as some kind of defense against her or something, and it was an interesting idea, but I just don't think they played around with it nearly as much as they could have, despite it being a running motif throughout the story. The concept of the game still could have worked if written with these rules in mind. I just think it was a wasted opportunity to have all this build up with the mirror, only for it to become progressively less relevant as the story moved toward the finale, that there's so much other lore going on with, like, the roses, the nails, the ritual of how to, put her spirit to rest, and the way the game itself works, that I just think the horror factor of the mirror got lost in the shuffle over time with these expanding, increasingly more complicated, or in some cases outright contrived, supernatural shenanigans that made the mirror feel like a one-trick pony or an afterthought at points. I'll definitely discuss Stay Alive in another episode, maybe video game horror, or that goes more in depth with the stuff that it did well versus stuff that it could have done better. Yeah, of all the things about that movie that creeped me out, I would say The Mirror wasn't really one of them. Aside from that one jump scare with the main protagonist staring at himself in the mirror, and then the reflection's eyes roll back into its head and the mirror cracks or something. Apart from that, which in my opinion was, just a cheap jump scare, and none of the mirror related stuff really stuck with me afterward the first time I saw that movie. And that is going to do it for today's episode of Horror Convos. Look forward to part 2 of our deep dive into this topic next time, when we do a little speed dating, getting to know every version of our main mirror, Lady Mary. Comment below, what were your scary experiences with reflections growing up, assuming you had any? What's your favorite piece of horror media that involves mirrors, and why? Remember, this is more than a podcast, it is a dialogue between horror fans. Once again, I do apologize for this episode being shorter, but hope you still had some fun and come back hungry for more. Here's your regular reminder that Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and ad-free on Patreon, along with other exclusive content. Be sure to like, subscribe, and shatter that notification bell so you never miss when the newest golden eggs are laid out of the rectum of my brain. Okay, love you, miss you already, don't leave me! Bye.